So I want to start by giving you kind of an overview of what is going on in the municipal context around sustainable consumption. And specifically, I want to hit on a couple of major topics. First, how is this concept or topic emerging within cities? You know, it's really a very nascent conversation that's been taking place over the last couple of years, so I'll trace a little bit of that for you. I also want to focus in a little bit on the opportunities and challenges of advancing sustainable consumption in the municipal context. And we'll just touch on this lightly. I suspect it's you know, a forecast of a number of the issues that we'll be talking about as a larger group. And then finally, to point out some of the early efforts that have already been going on, particularly here in the West Coast, to forge a policy foundation for some of that change. So I have to give props to EPA, because they have a lot to do with how we all got involved in this, and specifically the work by EPA in 2009 that for the first time really helped articulate the greenhouse gas impacts of consumption. It helped us all at the city level start to connect the dots between the work that we'd already been engaged in around climate action planning and the role of consumption and the importance to bring it into that topic area. So the important takeaway here is that the work EPA pushed out in 2009 had this really important conclusion, and that was to recognize that roughly 42% of the greenhouse gas emissions nationwide could be traced to the provision of goods and food. And in doing similar analysis here in Eugene, our number is actually a little bit higher. It comes in closer to like 55 to 58% of our carbon footprint in this community is attributed to those sources of emissions. So this portal of climate action planning is how a lot of cities, again, particularly here on the West Coast, have come into this discussion. We're starting to see sustainable consumption and consumption at large being addressed through our climate action plans. For example, the climate action plan for the community of Eugene has a chapter dedicated to consumption and waste. That's true for a number of cities on the West Coast. We're also seeing it begin to emerge in the accounting practices. We touched on that just a little bit in the previous panel, where the questions about community-wide consumption are, we're tackling those through our greenhouse gas inventory methodologies, which are very much in flux. I don't want to go into a lot of detail there, just to highlight that that's where a lot of this thinking is currently happening. An important thing that I will flag, however, because I hope that we'll have a chance to get back to this, is that a major barrier for the work that we do at the municipal level is the fact that we don't have a reliable or feasible way of measuring consumption at a community scale. And you know, us bureaucrats, we've got to be able to measure it so we can justify our work in that area. So if we don't have a good way to measure it, it really, really is a barrier for our continued work. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail because you'll have a chance to meet a lot of the city representatives who can articulate more of their activities for you. I just want to highlight that as we look at what cities are starting to do in addressing consumption, it really spans the gamut of traditional city activities. We see some activity in research. Some cities are now being forced into a regulatory mode, particularly around the entrance of Airbnb and Uber. We also see efforts around outreach, and you'll be hearing about that particularly from the city of Portland. But cities are also engaged in collaboration and support, particularly with community organizations, and we have lots of good examples to share around that. One specific example from Eugene is that we just hosted a sharing workshop back in June in collaboration with the Center for a New American Dream, and Anna Wimbo is here today to represent that group. So we're all dabbling in different areas where we think we might have some leverage to start moving this concept forward. I will say even the most leading examples like Portland and Vancouver, BC, fall shy of a comprehensive strategy, and I think that's part of what we hope to get out of this conversation over the next couple of days is some of the skeleton for what that comprehensive strategy might be. I mentioned that some cities are having to tackle the issue from a regulatory perspective, even if they don't even think about consumption or think that Airbnb is part of something called the sharing economy. They may not even have the luxury of thinking about a broader response. They're being forced into more of a regulatory response. And I understand our local paper had a headline news story today about just that. So we're a good example right here at Ground Zero in Eugene.
Headline.
Yeah, there you go.
City tells Uber to stop driving.
Yep, there you go. We're not the only city, unfortunately, that is forced into that position, and it is unfortunate because it tends to dominate the dialogue when we much prefer a broader, comprehensive response. But that's unfortunately where things are. So some of the opportunities I wanted to point to, these are recognizable to all of you sustainability directors in the audience, but for most of you as well. There are, long-standing sustainability program areas where this is a natural fit. And this is just a short list of some of the obvious ones. So I think we have a lot of opportunity to frame consumption as having relevance for each of these areas and leverage in each of these areas. And again, this is likely a forecast of what we'll all be talking about, so I won't drill down too deeply into it. One of the other things that we have working in our favor is public opinion. And I know that's not sufficient, but it is an important component. And you heard some of the national poll results. I think it was in Helena's presentation, but I will share that we have the great fortune of working with Tom Bowerman here in Eugene. He's one of our local residents, and we've had a chance to collaborate with him on some Eugene-specific opinion polling around the topic. And our numbers actually came in a little bit lower than the average Tom had on some of his other surveys, but it's still a powerful statement that over 65% of the folks polled here in Eugene agree with that same statement, that we'll be better off by consuming less and living more simply. And that in fact, when Tom followed up with an internet poll, the number came up to about 85% agreement. So strong agreement around that proposition. And I'll share with you that those public opinion results have been appropriated by certain members of City Council and our mayor and used to great advantage. So I'm really, really happy to see that kind of thing become part of the public dialogue. So some of you might recognize our friends Mr. Knox and Mr. Socks from your childhood. This is where Mr. Knox would say, "Now wait just a minute, Mr. Fox, sir." I wanted to be able to highlight some of the response that we're seeing at the local government level, and I'm sure that this is not unique to Eugene, but really key questions about what is the relevance of dealing with this issue at the local government level. Surely consumption is something that's a function of much larger systematic forces, things like the market and federal government policies around taxation and so on. What is the appropriate role for a city in trying to grapple with something so big? And another part of the dialogue that we hear locally is this idea that you start mucking around with consumption and that is a threat to our local economy. Our local economy is dependent on a certain level of consumption. Our businesses are structured around it. What's the alternative? What's the reality, here at the community scale if we're going to be calling for changes in consumption? So some pretty strong pushback, and we have to give those due attention, and I'm sure we will be. I suspect some of those themes will be coming out in our fishbowl exercise tomorrow. I think it's a real opportunity for some reframing, and I wanted to point out some of the things. I know I heard these in the talks this morning, some of these same themes, but this is how I like to try and reframe it in the municipal context. First of all, is this question about prosperity. I think when we start talking about consumption, it raises bigger questions about what is prosperity? What is meaningful prosperity? How do we measure it? Are we going to be slaves to GDP forever? Or maybe there's another way to be thinking about this. How do we measure it? How do we promote it at the local level? And our city manager, for example, has been involved in a community conversation around this to try and expand the notion beyond just strict economic prosperity. Let's talk about some of the other things that add to quality of life and well-being. Another reframing opportunity is around supporting new patterns of ownership and purchasing. Unfortunately, one of those is playing out in the news today, but I think there are other opportunities for us to do that. Just over the weekend, for example, we were able to applaud the launch of Car2Go, another short-term rental opportunity in the transportation realm, but another indicator of some of these changing patterns of ownership and purchasing that a city can promote. The other theme that I would point to is one that I heard Cindy mention this morning, this connection to resilience. This is really important in the context of climate action work, which, as I mentioned in the beginning, is really the entry point for a lot of what city sustainability staff have been working on around consumption. And there's some really powerful framing, I think, that can be done around that, both in terms of rebuilding social capital that's been eroded through suburbanization and other forces, but also in recognition that especially in times of stress or emergency, that kind of reliance and social capital becomes really critical. So it's an important part of that adaptation formula. And then finally, we have to address the social equity piece. You've all heard, many of the speakers today talk about that already. It's especially relevant in our community. We don't rank very high on a number of traditional socioeconomic factors like unemployment and average salary. We have a below average salary rate here in Eugene compared to the state. We have a higher unemployment rate. We also have a higher housing cost burden in Eugene than the statewide average. So this question of social equity and thinking about changes in consumption that can benefit those that are already stressed economically is really important, especially in our community. So just to wrap up, I'll highlight a few of the things that have been going on, and I've had the great pleasure of being involved in a few of these that are helping to advance the policy discussion. And again, many of these projects and programs are well represented in our group today, but a few highlights. First is the EPA West Coast Forum on Climate Materials Management. We've got both co-leads with us today, including Shannon Davis from Region 9 and Ashley Zanoli from Region 10. That forum's been in place for about 6 years now, I think. Correct me if I'm wrong. David Alloway and I are both founding members of it, and it's a really great resource for pushing this discussion about bringing these considerations into the local government context. The EPA forum has hosted a number of webinar series that have been excellent. Some of you have actually been speakers in that series. And we're actually planning to host a webinar on the outcomes of this workshop in December as part of the forum's webinar series. They also have lots of great resources on their website, a lot of attention around climate action planning tools. So big kudos there. Another important group, of course, is USDN. You heard Nils speak a little bit today about some of the focus and how it's gaining traction within USDN around sustainable consumption. We've got a user group that's focusing on it. We've got a couple of projects that are funded that are looking specifically at this, and we've got some of those folks represented in the audience as well. Another really important piece, and I'll just mention this because David's going to talk about it more, and that's the groundbreaking work of Oregon's Department of Environmental Quality to reframe their solid waste and recycling goals for the state around a materials management focus and a intentional effort to look at the life cycle impacts of our material use. A couple other projects to highlight. We've got a couple members representing One Earth here today, and they're working on a project called Cities in the Sharing Economy. They'll be hosting a table discussion at lunch about that today. So that project's underway and a great opportunity for cities to get involved there. And then finally, again, another project well represented today, the policy framework that was developed last year, I believe it was published last year by Shareable in collaboration with the Sustainable Economies Law Center. So some great foundational work that's already begun to help set the stage for what a city policy framework might look like, but I'm really eager to see what we all come up with over the next couple of days. Okay, thanks everybody.